This episode is brought to you by Ardan Labs Education. Sign up today to learn advanced concepts in Go, Docker, Kubernetes, Terraform, and more. Visit ardanlabs.com/education for more information.
Welcome to the Ardan Labs podcast. I'm Bill Kennedy, and our special guest today is Ian Lewis. Hey, Ian, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for getting up early for me.
Yeah, tell everybody where you are.
I'm in Japan. I'm in Tokyo, Japan, or at least close to Tokyo, Japan.
That's one of the few cities I have on my bucket list to visit. I got out of the airport one time because they were transferring us from one airport to the other, something with bad planes. I don't know what happened. So I got out of the airport one time, but it was just a bus, right? So haven't really seen that city yet.
Well, it's a nice place to live. Though it's one of those things that, like, if you kind of know the language and you can maybe deal with like some of the cultural differences, I guess, like it's a pretty nice place to live. I think it's really just, there's a lot, like, the culture shock can be a lot for some folks.
But you've been there a long time. I want to talk about how you got there and all that, but I mean, you've been there for years, right?
Yeah, I've been there I've been here, yeah, for let's see, I came in 2006, so like that would be like about 16 years ago, 15, 16 years ago.
All right, I don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. I kind of want to talk about how that happened. But before we do that, give everybody like 2 minutes on what you're doing today so we can get a sense of where you are today.
Sure. Yeah. So like for work, I'm a developer advocate for Google Cloud. I work in the, developer relations group, and I focus mostly on kind of container security, and most recently on like supply chain security. So like that's kind of one of the topics that's been consuming a lot of attention and thought recently at Google Cloud and elsewhere. And so that's something that I've been focusing on for about the last, I guess, 6 months or so. Before that, I focused on, kind of container security more broadly. I did a lot of work on some projects like the gvisor project that we have for, basically making sandbox containers that where you can, essentially run code that's either untrusted or, otherwise kind of dangerous, and you don't want it to like kind of escape the container. Or otherwise, take over your infrastructure, so you can run it in a sandbox like that. And that was like pretty exciting to open source because like that was a kind of really interesting and important project within Google. It's used in a lot of places, like our serverless products and whatnot. And I'm kind of involved in a bunch of different like kind of Go related things. So gvisor is also is written in Go, and most of the work that I do around containers is written in Go. Like a lot of the tooling, like Kubernetes and most of the container tooling nowadays is written in Go, and so like that's kind of the area or the space that I live in right now.
I'm glad you're. I want to get to this too, because there was a position that opened up at Ardan, and it was a security engineer. And I said to Miguel, Miguel, what does that mean? Like, this word security is so generalized in my head. Like, I don't know what that means, right? So at some point, I'd love to have a little bit of a conversation with you, since you've been focused on security. Like, what does that mean? Because my brain, I can't wrap my head around it all the time. I mean, I get a sense of, well, we don't want this thing to access the file system. Okay, but it's got to be bigger than that, right? So I'd love, when we get near the end, I want to have that conversation. But this podcast is really about kind of learning your journey to, where you are today. And one of my favorite questions I like to ask, but actually before I get there, real quick, did you do your grade schooling in the U.S. or in Europe or?
Yeah, so like if you want to go back, that far, then
Yeah,
I
we're gonna
did.
go back
I'm
far.
originally
Yeah.
from. Yeah, okay, cool. So yeah, I'm originally kind of from the DC area, so Washington DC. That's where I kind of grew up in Montgomery County, Maryland, and we did, I did grade schooling all the way up through high school in Maryland, and then went to college.
But wait, don't go too far. Yeah, don't go too far from. I'm gonna interrupt you at times because I don't want to go that far. But what year did you graduate high school?
Well, it's going to be embarrassing because everybody's going to know how old I am, but I graduated high school in 1999.
I only ask so I can get a sense of how, like, usually about 17 or 18 when you graduate high school. I have a sense of what the tech looks like. So that's why I ask. So I get a sense. And people who listen to the show know I graduated in '87, right? So '99 is when you graduated high school. All right. So now my favorite question. Here we go. I gotta set the stage there. So I want you to the first absolute thought that pops into your head when you think about that first time you saw or worked on a computer. A first moment pops in your head.
Like the first thought that I guess like popped in my head was kind of I guess like if you get the feeling of like seeing something that you're kind of curious about, like kind of like that's neat, like I guess that's the kind of feeling, I suppose. Like you don't get like a huge major dopamine hit when you're playing with computers necessarily, but you kind of get in dribs and drabs, and so that was maybe the feeling that I got, like, oh, this is neat, like this is kind of interesting. If I do this, it does this, and it's predictable, you know, that kind of thing, like really maybe appealed to me, and like that's maybe what the feeling that kind of comes to mind when I think about like kind of my early computer days.
Do you remember how old you were maybe around that, like that first kind of real experience you had? Were you in high school, junior high school?
Yeah, so I did with like use computers like when I was in high school, and as a lot of people do, like I kind of started with games first, and so I played like games. We used to have like a Commodore 128 actually, which is most people had like is familiar with the Commodore 64, but like we had a 128, which is kind of the next version. And what you did on 128 was you essentially changed it to 64 mode, and you did everything in 64 mode, which is exactly what is, so it was like useless that you had a 128. But like, so we had one of those, and I mostly played games on that. I didn't really do very much programming on that. It wasn't until later that I started actually kind of programming. It was more like I started programming more when I was in high school. I think we probably had a Commodore when I was in middle school, or we first got it when I was in middle school. But like it was in high school that I really started to like actually program, and start writing small kind of applications.
Were there classes in high school? Did you get to take?
Yeah, so like we did have a class like when I was in a senior in high school that I took, and that was like using, the Turbo C++. If you've ever used that, that was like back in the day. You had like Borland C++, and you had like I think there was like some a Microsoft one, or I don't remember what the competitor to Borland was at the time, but Borland was what we used in the in the class that we had in school. And so we did the kind of normal stuff, make the turtle program, like Turtle Paint or whatever they call it, where you like essentially make a drawing program that draws stuff. So that was interesting, learning about that. I think the most that in that class, like, I was a little bit ahead of other people. So like I tended to like add more to the programs and stuff like that. I wasn't like a lot ahead of other people, but I would kind of spend the extra time like adding new features to the program or whatever that we were given or assigned.
Were there other things you were more interested? But were there other things you were more interested in high school? Was the computer was just it was a class? Were you doing music, sports, something else? Like when you're going through high school, what are your at some point you start to think about what's next, right? Usually based on what you're interested in. So kind of really curious what you were kind of into in high school.
Yeah, like that's interesting. I mean, like I was a little bit interested or like into music. I mean, like I did, I was in the kind of vocal choir or the kind of chorus in school, and I did that through college. But and for sports, I did like kind of soccer in high school, early high school, but like kind of stopped doing that halfway through, and kind of the same for swimming. I wasn't really a sports person per se. It was really like kind of programming that kind of captured my interest like later in high school. But yeah, like that was a
The singing's interesting. The singing's interesting, right? Like, you can't be, especially in kind of snuck in that you were doing that in university. I mean, you must be a really good singer at this point, right? I mean, some of us can like not be tone deaf, but
yeah. I mean, like I did it through kind of through college. I didn't really do very much after that, like take lessons or anything like that, or do private have some private instruction. So I kind of mostly gave it up and kind of focused on my career after college. But the like throughout college, yeah, I did that, and it was that was really interesting and gave me a lot of other types of experiences that I wouldn't have otherwise had, for sure.
so you like karaoke? So if I make it to Japan, we're gonna do some. I want to hear Ian's voice now.
Well, we definitely have to do karaoke because, like, I mean, karaoke is just a thing you have to do in Japan. It depends on like what you want to, what kind of karaoke you want to do. I mean, we can take a couple of different methods there. Like we can do the kind of show off karaoke of like what's your musical tastes kind of like, or you can do the kind of more performative version.
I just want to have a couple of drinks and laugh while we're all. I mean, you're gonna be good up there. I'm gonna like barely hold my own, and somebody else. I'm not gonna be the best. I ain't gonna be the worst. My dad was a musician. I kind of grew up around it.
Oh, cool, cool. Yeah, like I think the thing about karaoke is that like you have to kind of figure out which songs that you can do pretty well. You can do some like kind of experimental ones every once in a while, like that you don't know quite as well, but like ones that pick some that like match your voice and that you like to do, and do those. And usually like you know everybody has like a song or a few songs that they can do that like are pretty good, right? No matter how what their kind of level is, right? Like that's something that I kind of like about karaoke. It's easy to, or it's everybody has like a song that they could do that would sound good, right? Like nobody's gonna sound terrible.
Well, you haven't heard my son sing. I think he's completely tone deaf. He can't get in tune on anything. It's kind of sad. I won't even give him the mic anymore. I'm just no. You sit. We're done. Let's get back to high school. So you found computer programming in high school, which is pretty cool. Outside of the singing and the what little sports you were doing. So as you're getting close to 99 and you're going to graduate, what is kind of in your head for what's next after high school? Obviously, we've heard already you went to university. So what were you looking at studying in university?
So I think at the time, like, computer science was the thing that I was looking at. So I was like fairly traditional in that sense. But like, at the time, I wasn't really, and I probably wouldn't say that I am now. Like, I'm like a kind of go getter kind of person, right? Like, at the time, I would, maybe a good description of the type of person I was like, you know, immature in terms of like emotional intelligence. Like, so not immature in the sense of like, you know, my ability to kind of socially interact with people. I cared about other people. I like, I was able to kind of make friends and interact with other people. But I guess like being able to kind of have direction, like form direction in my life and things like that was like a little bit harder. So instead of going to like kind of a large school, like I decided to go to like kind of a smaller school, right? Which is kind of a mistake if you're a computer science person, right? Like a larger school is much better in terms of the actual program, right? But I ended up choosing like a really tiny school that was actually kind of smaller in terms of the number of students than my high school. Kind of went with that in order to kind of build myself up a little bit more socially, like learn more like kind of the social type of, develop more socially, I suppose.
Was that school in the DC area?
That was actually in Virginia. So like it was kind of out in the Appalachian Mountains area. So like near Harrisonburg, Virginia. Yeah. So like that's what I did. And I kind of got lucky in terms of like the the teacher that I had there, or the professor that we had there at the time, at because like the guy that was doing the computer science, like leading the computer science program there, was actually kind of a person from a more kind of Ivy League type of background. Like he went to Northwestern for undergrad and Stanford for his grad school, and and he's like this guy like that works at this little tiny college in the middle of nowhere, Virginia. So like that was kind of like a little bit lucky to some degree to like get somebody that was like that,
Educated and knowledgeable at the time, you
just
think?
yeah, just educated, knowledgeable, like had all of the technical like knowledge, right, that I could get. And but also that like so I got like a lot of, or so, at least some of the big school kind of ways of thinking, and you know learning in terms of the computer science education, but also was able to do the small school thing, and develop more like socially into a more fully functioning adult, I would say.
Was your program like I went to school in SUNY Potsdam, and like I went over there in '88, right? I mean, talking State University. At the time, they were I guess recognized in the SUNY system for computer science, right? Again, small school, maybe 5,000 kids overall in that university, right? And it was a music school primarily too, but all musicians. But what I loved about my education there was it was more programming focused than it was like anything else. Almost every class required us to write code in the beginning, Pascal, and then C, which was great for me because I'm not an academic and I would not have done well if it was pure academic kind of stuff. I'm kind of curious what your program was more about. Was there a lot of programming involved? Was there then, because of the person running the department, I'm getting a sense that maybe there was more academic and theory than hands-on. I'm just curious.
Actually, not right. So like that was actually the school. This particular professor did lean kind of more heavily on the programming aspect of it. So, and I had that particular professor for the first 3 years, right? So the early classes definitely were more programming focused, right? So we did a lot of C++. I think most of the classes were C++. We did some Java kind of more later on. But mostly kind of focused on C++ and C for the first early classes that we did. And those were kind of like the basic computer science 101 type of, here's what a program is, here's how to write a program, here's how to compile it type of stuff, and then some algorithms classes where you do like the kind of sorting and kind of
Data
normal
structures.
algorithms,
Yeah.
data structures, that type of stuff. And some of the stuff later was more kind of operating systems, like kind of more broad kind of theory, and some there was a compilers course that I took, but yeah, it was mostly focused on kind of like technical aspects. I wouldn't say it was very focused on theory per se.
Do you remember which class you enjoyed the most? Like I remember, I was too immature to go to school at the time I was going to school. I was really, I loved school if I didn't have to go to class, okay?
I feel that like I was not really like a person that was like really interested or into school, and I mean I did well enough in the classes, but like I couldn't like I definitely didn't get A's in all my classes. I just kind of like did what was necessary and like did like the minimum amount of work kind of thing. But yeah, like
Was
in
there,
terms of like what
yeah,
was my
was there
favorite
one,
class,
yeah, because I remember the one class I had that I really enjoyed. Like,
yeah. So there was one that was like a there was one that was called like an independent study that I did, and that was like not a class per se, but it was for credit, right? And so what we did during that was like I essentially picked a project, right, that I would do over the course of the semester, and I would research this project, talk to other people about the project, how to kind of, figure out how to do it, and then kind of build a program, you know, and kind of essentially like write a report about it, towards the end, right? And so it was a really interesting course because I could like kind of choose what I wanted to do or what was like kind of interesting to me, and I could choose something that was like going to be challenging. And I got a lot of like one-on-one time with the professor, like talking to him, because essentially I would meet with him like every twice a week or something like that, and have like a full half hour or something like that, where I think it was about a half hour where I would like be able to talk to him, and have a lot of like kind of high bandwidth conversation.
what was the project? What was the project, Ian? What was the project you chose?
What I did in there was I wanted to create a an atomic orbital viewer. So like essentially something that would visualize an atomic orbital. So like for an electron around an atom. So like uh, so you can, if you're kind of a physics person, you'll know that like an electron orbit, like if you as you kind of go out to the bigger kind of atoms that exist, right? You start with like hydrogen, right, with like one electron that has this like one type of orbit, and then you kind of go out to helium that has like two electrons, and that's in one orbit, and then you get to the next orbit, which is at the I think it's the third electron. You kind of get another orbit, and like each of those orbits has like a completely different kind of shape to it. um, and the way that it kind of works is it's like a cloud essentially. Like this electron is, there's a probability that it is in any at a particular point. You can calculate like essentially the probability that it's going to be there. So there's like kind of a probability distribution like in 3D space. And so what you can do is essentially just, if you do something really simple, you can just like pick a point of space or something, like a random point in space, and say like, is there what's the chance of an electron being at this point, right? And then you pick like a random number between 1 and 0, and you say like, okay, is it before like greater than that or less than that, right? And if it's like greater than that, like you can put a point there, right, in 3D space. And then you just do that a bunch of times, right? And you get this like visualization of an orbital. And so that's kind of the project that I planned on doing. And the tricky bit was really kind of figuring out how to actually come out with, well, there's two things that I wanted to learn. One was the kind of physics part, and one was kind of the how do I make a program that's like, first off, like a UI program, because I haven't really done like UI for like, and then the other thing was like, how do you like make a 3D model, right, so that you can rotate, and look at.
Oh, that seems really complicated stuff to try to do. And
I mean, I did something really simple, right? Like I just put points in space, and then you can kind of rotate that like in a canvas, right? Like so, like that's actually like, if you kind of look up how to do that, that's like it's actually kind of surprisingly easy, like to do it in a very simple way, right? Like the way that I did it at the time was just the very simple way that of taking you can take a specifically crafted vector. So like that's essentially an array that's like has 3 points in it or three numbers in it, and you can do array multiplication against a 3D point like an X, Y, and Z, and you do that for like essentially all the points, and you can kind of rotate a model, right? And so you use a slightly different vector, like it's essentially like 1 0 -1 1 1 0, right? Like there's a bunch of vectors that you can multiply your points against in order to rotate them in different directions, like left and right, up and down. And that's the easiest way to do it, is just using vector multiplication. And that's what I did at the time. You can get really complicated and use things like quaternions, like which is a little bit more involved, but is a lot more efficient when it comes down to kind of rotating a lot of points. But like, I didn't really know about that at the time.
Yeah, no, that's cool. As you are about to graduate university, right? Sounds like you got a nice kind of strong foundation on the computer science here in Virginia. So now we're talking like 2003, I guess, around the time you're going to graduate. What are you thinking is next for yourself?
Yeah, so around that time, we had, there were like several like kind of colleges or companies that were like recruiting out of the school, right? And so one of them was a company that did essentially built like kind of enterprise software or like database software for kind of these small 2 and 4 year institutions, right? So this college was actually using the software from this company, and they did kind of recruiting of like new graduates out of schools where their customers, right? So like their customers were schools, and so like they would also kind of recruit out of these schools. And so I had an internship with that company during my senior year. So like between junior and senior year, I worked for them over the summer as an intern. Did several different projects. I don't remember exactly what they were at the time, to be honest. But I worked in like accounting, essentially, like the kind of the finance office stuff that you would have at your university, where like you go to pay bills and do things like that. Was where I worked as an intern.
But you were doing programming for them, or you were doing like
Yeah.
IT? You were doing programming. You were programming the software they were using.
Yeah, I was programming the software that they were using, and like they were using some pretty old software to be quite.
What was it written in? Old like AS400 mainframe COBOL, or like what were you programming?
Well, almost worse. So they were using a kind of an old IBM kind of database, which was a lot different from what you would consider like a database nowadays, right? Like everybody, SQL and stuff was like kind of all the rage, but this is like kind of predating that almost. So you essentially had like it was like a database in a programming environment, like all at once, and so you don't really have the kind of server client kind of paradigm where you send a query to the server and it sends back a response with data, right? Like you have this kind of environment that you can kind of run, like you run a program or you run this like you kind of connect to it like a terminal, and then it will run a program that has like kind of direct access to the database. So like the programming or the execution environment or the runtime environment is actually running like with the database on the machine. And you would essentially just like, you could do some kind of types of queries on the database to like be a little bit more efficient, but you were essentially like looping over tables instead of like in a programming language rather than, writing something like a SQL query. And so this was written in like what was called Unibasic. So like probably only a few people are probably really familiar with what that is, but it's essentially a basic style language that you would write this code in. And then the company had a bunch of macros and things like that that they had on top to make it a little bit more to make programming a little bit better or easier, but it was pretty out there.
Did you enjoy working on that at all while you were interning there? And or was it cool because you had a job and you were doing programming, or was it like, I'm kind of curious if you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually like kind of did enjoy it. It was like, I mean, it was the kind of really early programming, job, right? It was the first job that I ever had, right? So that was in that sense, like, yeah, I enjoyed it. There was a lot of like I as an intern, like I worked in finance or whatever, and then I actually ended up going and joining the company after that, and then kind of worked in a little bit more of a like it's not really all that kind of bleeding edge, but like at that company it was like kind of like a more one of the more advanced teams that was working on kind of stuff to be able to use like more SQL style tools and SQL style incorporate a lot more like kind of SQL style models into the system.
How long were you? How long were you at this company?
Let's see, I was there for like from 2003 to 2006, so that was about 3 years, I suppose.
Did they by 2006 get off of that uni basic system, or they were still running that in 2006? You don't know.
No.
Are they still even around?
Yeah, I mean they're like they're not around in the sense that like but they were bought by a competitor, like a larger competitor. So I imagine like the first order of business once they were bought was to like get rid of that old stuff and like move over to kind of more modern stuff that the competitor was using, or that the
Were you there at the time they got bought? Do you know if the competitor had better tech and they were just buying customers or something?
I'm pretty sure the I mean I know that the competitor had like kind of better tech, I suppose, but yeah, I mean like better is relative, like neither of them had like particularly good tech, to be honest.
Yeah. What made you in 2006 decide to move on? What were you just bored there? Was it done? Did an opportunity fall into your lap?
The real like kind of impetus to leave was just kind of like I was kind of seeing like where my career was going to go, like at so I was starting to think about like a little bit more about like what do I want to do in the future, right? Like where do I want to be in 10 years? Like um and the choices were kind of like, I mean, I'm in the DC area, right? So it's like, okay, if I'm going to stay in the DC area, like I'm going to either kind of be working at a place like Datatel, which is this company that I used to work uh, for a long time, right? Like, do I want to do that? Well, no. Uh, and I kind of saw that like a lot of people, like once they got into this kind of like ecosystem of like these tools and stuff like that, like they can't get out essentially, and so they're like, they either work at that company or they work at one of the schools that uses that company's software, or you essentially stay in the orbit of that company for like your career, and I didn't really want to do that.
Yeah, you saw people that were there for 20 years, right? Like I've walked into a couple companies where like everybody's 15, 20, 25 years. That's what you were seeing? That scared me, to be honest with you, when I've seen some of that.
I think that it was a blessing to leave, right? Like I at the time didn't really have very much experience, like other than that company, so I didn't know was like what how greener the grass was on the other side, or any of that, But but at the same time, like looking back, I can see that the people that were there like 20 years or whatever didn't know either. Like they were kind of like living in the bubble, right? Like, so yeah, I didn't want to do that. Like, I didn't want to be like doing this for 20 something years or whatever. Like, or quit and go work for some small college out in the middle of nowhere, or you know. So that was one choice, right? Like you could do that, or you could kind of like in the DC area. There's like if you're in tech, it's like government contracting, right? Like
there's a lot of money in
military contractors.
Yeah, I had a friend.
Sure. There's a lot of money in that.
His whole life was billing at $200-300 an hour on these government contracts that he could get, was in PeopleSoft too, by the way. He tried to recruit me to work with him, and I spent 2 weeks learning PeopleSoft, and my brain went, I don't care how much money's in this. I can't do this. I can't do it. I can't keep the money.
Yeah, and if I'm not mistaken, yeah, PeopleSoft was like a Datatel competitor back in the day.
Yeah, one of those ERMs where you build the screens and.
Yeah, exactly. Like that's the kind of stuff that Datatel did for colleges, right?
They were cool systems at the time. There were like 3 or 4 of them out there, PeopleSoft being one, where you had everything, accounting, HR modules, this and that, and you build the screens and the queries behind them would work, and then you'd write the reports. And we were using PeopleSoft at a company I was at, and dude, I couldn't. My brain, I was so bored. I didn't care how much money I was going to make.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing. It's like I didn't want to do that right forever. Like it was boring like after a while, and I wanted to do something else. And it didn't really appeal to me to like do government contracting either. Like I didn't want to get like a security clearance and be working for like a military contractor or something like that. Like even at the time I was kind of like I'm even from like an ethical moral standpoint, I'm not like really super up with like working at a military contractor, which is like kind of where most of the people that like left the company that I was working for went to, or the people that I knew in the area that were doing IT were like working at military like contractors like Raytheon and stuff like that. So I was like, yeah, I mean, like these are the type of people that I'm going to tap for like looking for jobs and stuff. And like, I just don't want to work at these companies. So I had to do something totally different, like, or I had to move somewhere else in the US, or I had to move like out away.
You had to move, right? Like you were that was the industry that was in that town. There's either you're doing that or you had to move, because there's no real remote culture just yet in 2006.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like you're kind of just like, and like I wasn't particularly happy with the DC area. I mean, like DC is kind of like, you got museums and not much else. So, I mean, I wanted to do something different anyway, and so that's essentially when I moved to Japan.
See, that's wild, right? I don't want to be in this area because I want to work for somebody. We'll go to Japan. Like you gotta. This is a massive. Let me just put it this way: from my experience, there's a lot of people who live in the U.S. who never leave, right? Like this idea of even living somewhere outside. Maybe you travel for a week, but to live is really a foreign concept from my experience with people that I've met. So it's absolutely mind-blowing that you end up in Japan. You got to tell that story. You got to tell how that happened.
Yeah, so that kind of started like, because I had a roommate in college who was a very kind of interesting character. He was doing like an international studies major, and his thing was Japan, and he was like all into like anime and learning about Japan, and going to Japanese restaurants and doing stuff like that. So like he was a Japanophile, right? And that's kind of how he was my introduction to it. And so he like went to study there for a year, right? Like during our junior year. And then he came back for the senior year, and like then we kind of roomed together in the dorm again for our senior year. So I got to hear about like the stuff that he did in Japan and like all of that. And then maybe it was the time that he was gone at school that he had a girlfriend that was Japanese, and she came to visit a couple of times. And yeah, so like we kind of did that through school. I was mostly focused on like kind of computer science, doing my own thing at the time. But like that was kind of interesting to kind of learn about and get experience. And then like after school, like he moved to Japan like right after college, right? So he moved here and started teaching English under like this exchange like program. So like there's a thing called the JET program. It's like Japanese exchange and teaching or something, I can't remember. But like he went and did that Uh, and so he was doing that for a number of years. And so right after college, like, I had somebody that I knew was living in Japan. And so I went and visited him a couple times during the 3 years that I was working after college.
So you maintained a relationship with him. You maintained a relationship with him even after college.
Yeah.
That's kind of cool. So you got to visit Japan and had that local experience too, because he was. Did he speak Japanese while you were in university? Like this is like he really loved the culture. He really wanted to be there.
Yeah. So he was like, I don't know, like really at the time, like how, proficient he was or anything. Like I, I still don't really know, but like the he spoke enough Japanese to kind of get by, and you know certainly he learned a lot more after he moved to Japan after college.
So you went and visited him a few times, and so that's why you had that kind of locked in your head in 2006 when you're thinking about the next sort of move.
Yeah, exactly. So like that was like that's why there was an option that option of like in terms of a place to move that I thought would be interesting. Like that was an option that I would consider, I guess, or that I was considering, and that's because of him and because of that experience that I had.
So uh, were you also thinking like you had a place to stay at least in the beginning and that you could leverage English in Japan if you were going to work there?
Well, that wasn't necessarily like the thing at the time. I guess like also during that 3 years, like kind of in the US, like I kind of ran a kind of local meetup group. So you remember like uh meetup.com was like kind of starting up. So like we actually had like this meetup on the website that became meetup.com later. Um, and I don't even remember what it was called before it was called meetup.com, but it was like, essentially, like local meetups for people like with a particular uh, interest, right? And so we had one of these where like we started it up, and me and like one other guy at the beginning like was there, like who were kind of interested in Japan a little bit and learning the language and kind of learning it on our own a little bit. But eventually, like we actually got a lot of folks who were like Japanese kind of folks living in the area in DC and like kind of or in kind of the DC suburbs of Virginia, I guess. And so that was kind of rare because like you're not exactly like finding people like Japanese people like left and right like in the DC area, right? Like it's so it was interesting to like be able to like connect with people that like locally through that. And so like that's really kind of what gave me a lot more confidence that that would be like something that I would want to do because like I had a lot of friends who were Japanese that were like living in the US and had a lot of kind of had learned a lot through them like about kind of what the culture was like and what the you know how people kind of think and um
Yeah, no, that's wild. That's really interesting that you ended up with a meetup group that kind of morphed into that sort of community that you built, right? So it's almost like everything is pointing towards you got to be in Japan. So when do you make the final decision? Like, this is what I'm going to do. Do you decide to go out again and just dip your toe in the waters and see if there's work, or you just go heads down? I'm going to do this.
yeah so I went and started looking for companies or whatever that would hire me and like the hard part is like finding companies that'll like hire somebody who is can speak maybe some of the language but not quite enough that they could like not rely on anybody else to kind of translate for them or whatever, at least initially, and wanted to hire people and sponsor their visa essentially. Uh, that was that was a lot less of a thing back when I moved. Um, it's a little bit more of a thing there. There's like a few tech companies here that hire people from outside the country um, because they want to introduce a lot of like new ideas and things like that. And so they hire from outside the company, or from outside the country. But there wasn't a whole lot of it when I moved. That was kind of the most difficult part. But I was fairly lucky to find a company that would sponsor me fairly quickly, and I was basically willing to take essentially any job if it wasn't English teaching, because that's basically the way that most people come to Japan, is like they start teaching English, and I want to avoid that as much as possible.
So you got this. So this was all done. Did you interview and everything was done over the phone, I guess, or over chat at the time? I guess we're 2006. We have chat.
Yeah, luckily I did the interviews kind of over the phone. They were like, I guess, not super discriminatory or like discriminating, I suppose is the word. Like, it was, the hiring process was fairly easy to get through. It turns out like the company was kind of like an interesting little company, like with a very esoteric kind of what you call in Japan, like the shacho, like the CEO of the company was like a very kind of outgoing, very different kind of Japanese person. And that's kind of one of the reasons why he was like, hiring people who are foreign and doing like kind of, he was kind of doing a lot of like he was just kind of out there, right? And that was a really interesting experience for like a different reason. But like I was able to get that job and like kind of work with that company for a little while, and kind of get my feet wet in Japan.
So what did you two things before? What did your friends and family say when you said, I'm moving to Japan to live and work there? Did they think you were like crazy, or they thought it was great?
Yeah, like funnily enough, I mean, like, I had a couple of friends who were like I was working with at the time, right? And at that company, right, like doing college software, and like when I decided to have to like move to Japan, like he and I talked, like my closest friend at the time, like he and I talked or whatever, and basically both of us were going to the meeting to tell each other that we're moving away, like, at the exact same meeting. So it was very interesting. Like, you too, right? Like, so like he was telling me he's going to go and like start working remote in Charlottesville or whatever in Virginia. And I was like, yeah, well, I'm moving to Tokyo. So I guess like, it's all good, right? But like, that was kind of a little bit of a coincidence. But my other friends were basically the folks from the meetup and stuff like that. So they were like, oh yeah, like this is a natural thing. Like my friends at least were really understanding and like kind of encouraging along those lines. Like my parents were kind of like my mom wasn't super happy that I was doing that just because of the distance. But my dad was kind of like, well, I figured that you would move away at some point. Like, so maybe didn't expect it to be like all the way to Japan, but yeah,
that's cool.
I guess it might as well be that.
So what was the job entailing, and how long were you at that company in Japan?
Yeah, so I was there for 2 years, and that was a very interesting kind of company. It was actually like a software company that built kind of point of sale type of software, and like essentially like their main thing was like making software for beauty salons, right? So like big, like big-ish kind of beauty salons. So like it was essentially like kind of point of sale software, and registration software for appointments, right? So you would like, they would have like a menu, right, of things that they did, right? And like that would be, they would then do all of the point of sale stuff, and like the software would also like help you do like your accounting and stuff like that for your salon. And
what was the tech stack? Was this like VB Basic that just ran on a PC in the salon with a, I don't know, MySQL database behind it?
Yeah, so the point of sale system was essentially that, right? Like it was a Visual Basic like application that ran on the machine, and then it would essentially back up data, like do data backups to like a remote backup, which you could then like fairly easily restore locally. That was like kind of the point of sale system. What I ended up doing was like more of the kind of building out much more of the online services that they had. So one of the things that they had was a mailing list application. So like doing mailing list management. So like what a lot of these salons would do would be like you go there, you sign up for the mailing list, you get a coupon or something, and then the salon would send you messages about like other campaigns they were doing or whatever marketing crap, and then like so they would manage these like these lists, um these mailing lists, and this at the time was like everybody was like using these like flip phones like that had email and kind of very rudimentary internet access at the time, and so you could like people would essentially get these mails on their phone, right? And so I was working on that software and also on this like kind of new registration system that people could use like by registering from their phone, right? So they could register for appointments at a particular salon on the phone, and then that would tie into the the salon, right? And the salon would have had enough like part of the VB application that ran in the salon was like this calendar application that would show like the appointments that they had, and they could enter appointments in manually through the calendar, or people could like uh, register appointments over the phone, and then like in the salon they could like approve them or whatever. That was kind of like the stuff that I did at the time. Yeah.
I mean, you don't have a lot of right? Your reading and writing skills right now are not there. I'm sure maybe you have a 2,100 word vocabulary. Are they writing this code outside of the keywords that are in English? How much of that code base is using the Japanese language? Like, are you struggling?
Yeah, like so like the typical way that you write code in Japan is like you generally use alphabetic characters for the code itself, right? So the identifiers, all of that is all written in English. And so you'll usually use something like like a reasonable English translation of a particular word if you're going to use it in code as an identifier. But most of the comments are written in Japanese. So at the time, I'm like, I started out for the first maybe 6 months or so. Like I had another guy in the office who was like kind of a go-between that would speak English and also speak Japanese and stuff. And then, he ended up leaving the company, I think, after 6 months. And then after that, like, you know, I had built up enough that I could kind of get by in the office. It wasn't great, but um, I could kind of get by in terms of like communication. Uh, that was a little bit of a difficult time for a while. But yeah, in terms of the code base, it's mostly just outside of the comments, it's almost all in English.
Did you end up taking classes to learn at some point? Did you decide to take some classes to learn Japanese, or were you just?
So yeah, that's an interesting question, right? Like some people learn better in the kind of class environment. In my case, like I thought it was better to do mostly self-driven study. I think that would be more efficient. Um, because I'm kind of working at the time. Also, I'm thinking about my kind of tech career and my like, learning tech as well. Like I don't need like two large things that I'm doing or large things that I'm trying to study at the same time. So like I want to make each as efficient as possible. So the thing that I would do is very self-driven study, and particularly learn and study things that I could use on a daily basis, right? Like so I would, as I encountered words, I would add them to like kind of custom dictionaries, and then I would use those in like flashcard programs uh, um, to study vocabulary. And yeah, I just continued doing things like meetups also in Japan. So like going out and meeting people and just having drinks and talking and trying to muddle through that uh, in order to kind of get the experience. Because uh, like learning vocabulary out of a book and actually practicing it, like speaking, is a completely different set of skills. One ties into the other, but you know, it's kind of like actually speaking, like it's a real time activity. So like it's kind of like if you learn baseball out of a book, right? You can't exactly do that. You have to know the feel, like when you hit a bat or like when you swing it, or you have to know like the ball needs to be about this position before I need to start my swing. Like that kind of thing you can't really get from a book, right? Like you can't just like
No, I get it being in Miami for 25 years. Like, I still don't speak Spanish. My problem, and my wife and her kids will laugh at me, is my hearing is horrific. I will say something, I will repeat what I hear, and they laugh at me and they go, no, it's this. And I go, that's what I'm saying. They're like, no, there's this little tone you're missing right here. I go, I don't hear this tone, and because I can't hear it, I can't produce it. And it's super frustrating for me. It's super frustrating for me.
yeah, I think that this was like kind of an area where the kind of being a singer or like being somebody who was in a chorus or whatever was like would help me, because we did a lot of speaking in other languages, right? And even if you're singing in another language or in English, the way that you sing something is a lot different than the way that you would say it, right? Like so you're pronouncing particular things, like emphasizing certain vowels. You're shaping your mouth in a different way, right? Like, and you receive instruction on how to do that. And so it's kind of that sort of knowledge you can kind of transfer a little bit over into learning a language and understanding like tones and like how to pronounce things that are not present in English or in your native language, for example.
Yeah, I would really, I know already I would struggle. I can speak enough food to order and everybody tolerates it. But
Yeah.
so you spent 2 years at this job. What happens next? I guess they held your visa, right? So you needed to find another company that would continue to sponsor you at that point. And then is there a road to citizenship? Do you have citizenship there? Are you allowed to have dual citizenship? Or is there a road to kind of having permanent, what do they call that? Permanency? I mean, I'm not sure what the word is.
Residency, right? Yeah. So yeah, so at the time I was on a work visa, right? So that means that I have to have an employer that's essentially sponsoring the visa. But outside of the initial sponsorship to get to the visa, like the company doesn't really need to do anything, right? Like they just have to be like, okay, yeah, you're employed here, and then I tell them the employment or the immigration office that I'm now working at this company, but that company doesn't really necessarily have to do anything. It's really kind of
There's no more money involved. It's not like here where
yeah, they
suddenly.
don't have to pay the government.
Okay.
Yeah. So like the initial thing is like when I have to move to Japan, like the company that sponsors you have to pay money to the government and has to wait until your visa is done and come over and all of that stuff. So they have to be willing to do all of that rigmarole for you. Whereas like when you move to the second company, it's a lot easier because you just get a new job and that company, like they hire you like just like anybody else, and you essentially just deal with updating your visa information. Um, so that was fairly easily done, and like Japan's kind of nice in that like they don't the work visas are not like H-1Bs or like some of these temporary visas that you have in the US. So you can renew it essentially definitely if you're working. Um, so you don't have to worry about like, oh, what am I going to do when my temporary visa runs out because I can only renew it 3 times or something. Um, so that was kind of nice. But eventually, like, you know, like I kind of settled down and got married. And so, like, after the work visa, I transferred over to like a spousal visa, which allowed me to essentially do any type of work. So there was like some restrictions on the work visa.
But that didn't happen in the first two. That didn't happen in the first 2 years, right? So, or did it? Did you meet? You met your wife in those first 2 years?
Well, yeah. So the first 2 years, like I met my wife, but like we weren't married at that time, right? Eventually, I did move over to that, but that was a few years later.
So what happens that you leave this company now? Like, what's the next? What's that next opportunity that you take?
So I got kind of interested like in kind of Python at the time. So that's like how I kind of met a few people that were kind of doing Python and learning Python. And like this is kind of when the kind of early web development in those languages like Ruby and Python was starting to take off, right? Like you started to have like the rack protocol being developed for Ruby and like the WSGI protocol being developed for Python, and these type of frameworks starting to be built on top of it. And so that's kind of how I started getting involved in Python, because I wasn't really necessarily a Ruby fan, but I really liked the Python. I did a little bit of it in college, and so I wanted to learn more about it. And so there was like some communities that I started joining to kind of start connecting with other Python folks and learning about Python. And at this point, like I'm much more kind of proficient at the language, so I'm kind of interacting directly with Japanese folks in Japanese, and talking about programming and stuff like that. Um, that's essentially how I started to like look for a new job, because I wanted to start doing stuff in Python and you start doing more stuff.
So where do you end up? Yeah, what's the job that you end up?
I ended up working for a company, like a kind of small company that was doing kind of contract type of work. And we were initially doing work for like uh, a company called Cyber Agent, which is like a kind of, I would say, tech media company. Like they do like ads, they have an ads division, they have a bunch of other kind of like media, like online websites and things like that that they run. And so we were working on a particular website for them for a while. And then, and pretty much the whole company was just working on that one project, right? There was only a few people at the company. And we were doing all of our work there. And then, like, that was like right around 2008, I guess it was. Like, so like 2009, early 2009 is kind of like, I think that's around the time Lehman Shock happened, something like that. And then there was like a bunch of stuff happened, and like we ended up like going and starting to work on other projects. Like the project that we were working on kind of got suspended, and then we kind of took off and started working on other projects. But what ended up happening was, it was kind of interesting, is that like a lot of these companies were starting to cut back. So kind of almost paradoxically, our company like picked up in business quite a lot, because like people were trying to look to like farm out development to contract companies like ours. And so we ended up picking up a lot of different types of work at the time. And folks didn't those companies like didn't care whether we used Python or not. Like they were happy for us to use Python, and so we were like, yeah, sure, we're going to do it this way, and we're going to hire a bunch of Python engineers that kind of really are passionate about Python and programming. And like that's kind of how the company grew.
And how long are you with that company? How long were you with that company?
Yeah, I was starting there in 2008, and then that we got to the point where we were like, I think it was 2000, and it was early 2015 when I left. So it was about 6 years.
Dude,
maybe,
you were
that I
there a
was doing
long
that.
time. Wow. Why?
Yeah, relatively.
What made you? Why do you? Wow. Why do you think you were there for that long? I mean, it's a long time. Were you constantly challenged? You were just comfortable there? It was a good job. The money they kept giving you, right? Like, what kept you there for 6 years?
I guess like there was like a few things. Like it kind of was like early on, it was just like that I was kind of learning new stuff, learning Python and stuff. And eventually, like I kind of became comfortable, but like the company started to do like other things, like starting to experiment with building their own kind of services. Um, and so I was part of that, which was kind of interesting to me. That and like I don't know, there weren't like really a whole lot of jobs that were like really sticking out to me, I suppose, at the time as being something that like I really wanted to do. You know, I was fairly happy working with Python for a while and working at that company and with the people that I was working with.
So we got like 20 minutes left. So I want to get to a few things before we're done. And I'm kind of now curious. You're there for 6 years. Just to jump a little bit, how do you end up at Google in Japan? Because I guess they have an office out there, right? Because you have to be close to an office. So maybe talk about how you end up at Google. Is that the next thing in 2015, or you bounce around a little bit before?
So so that's like another thing is like as part of like kind of the Python, like doing Python stuff, like there wasn't really like kind of a Python community like that was really kind of gelled and active and doing things in Japan at the time. And so we were kind of, you know, a few of us kind of wanted to, you know, there were a few things like that people were doing, like, you know, going out drinking and doing some things like here and there, but there wasn't really like a community that was like doing concrete stuff. And so we decided to like build a conference that would, you know, people could go to and kind of try to build a more kind of grown up community, I suppose, around Python. And so we started like the PyCon JP conference.
What year? What year? What year was that you did that?
So this was like 2011, I think, was the first conference that we did. And then we did that for a number of years, right? And that grew to be still small, but like, you know, on the order of like over 1,000 people kind of conference.
Dude, that's not small. That that's not small. I don't think that's small. For a single language conference, that's really large.
Yeah. So it was, yeah. So it was actually pretty popular. Like there was a lot of kind of the folks that were doing it like really wanted to do something like that was well kind of put together. So a lot of attention was paid to details and stuff like that. I wasn't really good at that myself, but um, you know, there were folks that we were working with that were like really wanted to make it really nice for folks. Like we would always like make sure that we had like the kind of things that you would expect from a properly run conference, right? So like, you know, good keynote speakers, good program, good like food and, you know, things to do at the conference, good sponsors, like all of that.
So does this conference leads to Google knocking on your door?
Yeah, partly. So like that's kind of more of the kind of developer advocate kind of, you know, community style stuff that I was doing, right? So through that, I met some people that were like working at Google. Like I met some folks at PyCon that were in the US that were working at Google. And then also like kind of in 2008, I think like the App Engine was released that was supported Python in the very beginning, and so that was like a way for a lot of like new Japanese people to like try to learn Python and wanted to learn Python was because they wanted to use App Engine. And so like a lot of people would come into the community and kind of want to learn about Python. And, you know, I knew a lot about that. And I also like started getting involved with doing App Engine. And so like that's how I started getting into like the Google kind of orbit of people. And then I like got started on this in this like GDE program, which is like what they call GDEs now, which is like Google Developer Experts. And at the time, that was like a program that was like only for Japan and was called something like API Experts at the time. So I joined as one of those for App Engine back in probably 2011. And that's kind of how I started going to like things like Google I/O and Google conferences and stuff like that. And then eventually like kind of got tapped on the shoulder said like, hey, we have an opening for a developer advocate. Like, do you want to do that?
Nice. And you've been doing that.
Yeah. So that's how I kind of got.
And that was in 2015. At that point, that's when you joined Google, and you've been there ever since.
Mm.
How do you keep your? Okay, so let's get back to kind of where we started. We got like 15 minutes left, and I wanted to talk about this because you landed kind of on the security side of things. So, right, because that's you're now focused on security related to containers. You were doing security related to gvisor, cloud stuff, and this word drives me crazy. Security. I don't understand the word. So when I say to you, I'm looking for a security engineer, what pops in your head? What do you think that means when I say I need a security engineer?
So there's a couple of types of security kind of engineers, right? Like there's kind of the offensive security engineers, which are kind of more on they're going to do things like penetration testing and, the kind of more offensive type of stuff, like where they're going to like try to poke holes in things and find problems, like specific types of problems. So these are the kind of like red team and like to some degree blue team type of people that are like looking at specific vulnerabilities for specific mitigations. But when I hear security engineer, like I think more of somebody who is like an engineer that's thinking about the architecture of the system, somebody that's thinking about the threat modeling of the system. So like thinking about the types of threats and like the classes of threats that like can be a potential problem for a particular system and how to mitigate those, like how to change your company and like organize your company such that security issues don't crop up, like dealing with policy like related to how code gets created, like how code gets written and stored, how code gets reviewed, how code gets into your production system. That type of person, I would say, is the type of what you would think of as a security engineer. So they might be doing things like this type of threat modeling of architectures, like new systems that you're building. Like they'll do architecture reviews, they'll do threat modeling for systems, they'll do like reviews when like code, like actual code reviews for products as they're coming up, like, and if they're a security related product.
How did you get into the security side of things once you kind of got into this DevRel sort of role? I imagine your first, because of your Python background, I imagine that you were focused on growing Python communities or something when you started. How is your role kind of morphed from the time you started to now, and kind of how did you get into security?
So even as I was like changing to Google, I was thinking that like I was kind of wanting to move away from Python a little bit and start learning kind of Go and kind of other languages and branch out into those languages. And that's partly because I was interested in servers and web servers and web applications and APIs and, essentially backend kind of systems. And Python was really kind of moving in the direction of Python 3 and like less on this like asynchronous application, like backend applications, and more on like embedded stuff and like the machine learning and data processing, like and so I was not really interested in as much in that, and so I wanted to like start moving towards Go. So that's one reason. And then the second was like that I was really just interested in containers. Like I was very interested in Docker and Kubernetes, and those as an architecture for deploying applications and running applications, because I thought that was like a very smart way of doing it. And so that's how I kind of got into containers. And then I started going into security specifically, like around containers. And that's how I got into kind of doing security and the security space. And then now like moving into supply chain security and focusing on that area.
Now, like a lot of people think that the DevRel position is just you get on stage and you talk about product and stuff, but I it's a lot more than that. So like, where are you spending most of your time in this role? At least maybe to say pre-COVID and kind of now, because I'm sure some of that's changed as well.
Yeah, so pre-COVID, there was definitely more traveling and events and things like that. That's for sure. But the job definitely involves a lot more than just going up and giving talks. Certainly some folks focus on that a lot more than others, but it really, there's really like a large product kind of feedback or product improvement kind of aspect to developer advocacy. You're essentially like thinking, the idea is that you're an advocate for customers, right? So like the way that incentives kind of work at a company is that like the people who are developing the software are incentivized to do it in a way that's going to benefit the company itself, right? Like, and so you're supposed to, at least my interpretation of it is that part of that is like bucking that trend and trying to take the customer's perspective a lot more and do what's kind of right for them, and particularly the technical customers, so developers who are using your platform.
I guess the question is, what cloud is kind of really, is Amazon, is it in Japan, is it just really, again, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, or are there local companies too that you're competing against from a cloud that I don't know about because I'm not there?
Yeah, for the most part, it's Amazon, Microsoft, Google are kind of the players now. It was like a little bit less that in the past, but really like the ones in the previously were like kind of hosting services for the most part and didn't really provide much of an API on top of their services, right? The real magic with cloud is that you can have an API and you can say like hit this API and it'll create a VM for you, right? Like whereas other clouds, the local providers didn't really do that so much, right? You might be able to click a button on a website, but like there wasn't really any kind of programmatic aspect to it. And so those have mostly fallen out of favor nowadays. And so we're pretty much left with the big three, or those three. Yeah.
Amazing. So this move to Japan ended up really being, I think in the end, pretty amazing journey for you. Do you ever see yourself at any point, and maybe you've talked to your wife about it, moving back to the States, or this is it, like from what you can see?
It's a hard question to answer because like from a career perspective, working at some place like Google or like these kind of like large global companies, like it makes a lot of sense to like just move back to the US, right? Like the pay is higher in the US. Like all the people that are doing the development, the main people doing the development and the main people doing most of the product work are in the States. And so you have a lot less time zone problems to work with. And you're much closer to like the action, as it were. And so it makes a lot of sense moving back. That said, from like a personal standpoint, Japan is a really nice place to live. Like I have, personal reasons for staying, like aside from just that it's a nice place to live. And so like in reality, I like kind of prefer to stay here if I can. I'm not really looking forward to moving back to like a large city in the US and doing the whole travel or doing the whole like driving or commuting to work kind of thing. That's Public transport is terrible in the US and driving is not much better given like the traffic in a lot of places. So if I was going to go back to the US, it would definitely be like kind of more of a remote position, or I would be like not going into the office very often, or, I would have to work out some kind of arrangement where I was not, that I would be happy with.
Does your wife speak English? Does she speak English?
Yeah, so my wife speaks pretty good English, and she went to school for, I think, 7 or 8 years here. So she speaks pretty good English.
Do you speak a lot of English in the house? Like my wife is Colombian, or she rarely doesn't even have an accent. Like she's amazing. What she learned English. She came to the States like at 22 or something and learned English. One of the few people that have like little to no accent. But when she gets a little riled up, it's all Spanish coming at me. because she forgets I don't speak Spanish, right? Which I just look and I laugh and I'm like, this is really good. Like I'm not upset. Yell at me, go for it. I don't know what you're saying. I'm just kind of curious because I have a little bit of that dynamic, but we're in the U.S., so English is the main language. So I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, we speak English quite often in the house. Like I think that I speak English a lot more often now that I'm working at Google because most of the work is in English. But um, the yeah, we speak English a lot in the house, but like it kind of goes back and forth, and we're kind of both at the point where like we use both interchangeably, and so conversations will switch back and forth pretty often, and
That was the other question, the
we'll use
Spanglish.
Japanese words in the middle of English sentences and things like that. So
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's interesting. That's kind of cool. I guess you help each other too with the language over time, so that's kind of cool.
yeah, it helps. Like,
all right, we are out of time. This was really great. I got to meet you a couple times when I was in Singapore, I think, and India maybe. We were in India.
Yeah, we had like Singapore, and I think we were at India.
Yeah,
right? Like several years ago.
Yeah,
like, that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, so that was.
I hope we can go back there sometime.
So that's why I'm glad we got to. For me, this is like kind of catching up a little bit and getting to know your story, because I don't meet a lot of people who are living overseas like you are, and built an entire life there. So I don't know. I find the story super interesting. My family has always heard me say I want to move to Berlin, which I haven't done. So I think it's awesome what you did. I think it's super cool. If anybody wants to get in touch with you after listening to the show, and we'll put this in the show notes, but what's the best way for someone to reach out?
Yeah, so I'm on Twitter, at Ian M. Lewis, and that's probably the best way to reach out. My blog and website is ianlewis.org. So you can check out things that I write there and more about me there. But yeah, contacting me would be best done through Twitter. I'm kind of one of those people that still has their DMs open and can manage that. So at least for the time being, you can DM me or you can just @ me publicly on Twitter.
Nice. Perfect. All right. Thank you again for all of this time talking about your story and what you're doing. This is Bill Kennedy with the Ardan Labs podcast with Ian Lewis, signing off and thanking everybody for joining us, and hope to see everybody again real soon.